Every Christmas, my mother humiliated me with demeaning gifts while lavishing my siblings with expensive presents. After years of enduring her cruelty, I finally escaped and built my own life. But when I discovered her house was going into foreclosure, I saw the perfect chance to turn the tables. I used to think Christmas was supposed to be about family, love, and celebration. But in my house, it was never about that. It was a performance, one orchestrated perfectly by my mother. For as long as I can remember, she turned the holidays into a competition, a stage where she played the role of a generous, loving parent, but only when it came to my younger siblings. My brother Daniel and my sister Emily were always showered with expensive gifts, brand new electronics, designer clothes, the latest gadgets. One year, Daniel even got a car. Me? The gifts were never just bad, they were humiliating. Off-brand socks, a sweater 2 sizes too big from a thrift store, self-help books about finding direction in life. When I was 16, she gave me a weight loss guide for teenagers. I wasn't even overweight. I remember sitting there, holding that book while my siblings unwrapped their brand new iPhones. My mother just watched me smiling, waiting for my reaction. If I showed disappointment, she had the same speech ready every year. You should be grateful, some kids don't get anything at all. If I faked a smile and played along, she'd act like I was finally growing up. If I looked upset, I was selfish. It didn't matter what I did. She always won. And my dad? He just sat there, sipping his coffee, pretending not to notice. The day I turned 18, I made a promise to myself. I was going to get out. I spent years preparing for my escape. I worked nonstop, saved every penny I could, and the second I had just enough, I moved into a tiny apartment and never looked back. For years, I refused to go home for Christmas. I made up excuses, work, travel, anything to avoid walking into that house again. I had finally started building a life of my own space, my own routine, my own peace. But my mother? She didn't like that. First, the guilt trip started. You're ruining this family. Daniel and Emily miss you. Do you really want to be the reason we fall apart? At first, I ignored it. But over time, she wore me down. I started thinking, what if things were different now? What if she had changed? So after almost 7 years, I agreed to go home for Christmas. It was the worst mistake I could have made. Nothing had changed. The house looked the same. Expensive decorations, twinkling lights, and a Christmas tree surrounded by stacks of expensive presents. When I walked in, my mother smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Gift giving started the same way it always had. Daniel unwrapped a high-end laptop. Emily gasped over a designer handbag. Even my dad got an expensive watch. Then, it was my turn. My mother handed me a slim envelope, grinning like she had some secret joke. Inside, a printed-out list. Life tips for late bloomers. Some lines were highlighted. Advice about better financial responsibility, about taking charge of your life. I stared at the paper, and when I looked up, she was waiting, watching me, searching for a reaction. And here's the thing. I could have snapped. I could have thrown it back at her like she always wanted me to. That would have been the expected reaction. Instead, I tucked the paper back into the envelope, looked her in the eye, and said, "Thank you." And for the first time, I saw something new in her expression. Disappointment. She wanted me to crack. She wanted me to cause a scene so she could play the victim. But I didn't. Because at that moment, I had already started planning my revenge. Over the years, I had built something my mother never could: real financial stability. She spent money like it was nothing. Big vacations, designer outfits, fancy furniture. She flaunted wealth she didn't actually have. One day, an old friend mentioned something that changed everything. "Did you hear about your mom? Saw her name in the foreclosure listings?" I froze. I checked for myself. It was true. The same house where she had humiliated me, where she had held power over me for so long, was about to be taken by the bank. I didn't hesitate. I met with a lawyer, handled everything under the radar, and stepped in before anyone else could. By the time the foreclosure was official, I was ready. I placed the winning bid. The house was mine. And this Christmas, I had the perfect gift for my mother. The moment had to be perfect. The house was packed with relatives, everyone watching. My mother was at her peak, putting on a show, offering drinks, making sure everyone knew she was the queen of the holiday. Then, the gift exchange. When it was my turn, she handed me a cheaply wrapped box. Inside, a self-help book about forgiveness and a dollar store planner. I smiled, held up the book. Thank you. Then I reached under my chair and pulled out my gift for her. A large, neatly wrapped box tied with a gold ribbon. Her eyes lit up. She thought I had finally come to my senses, that I had splurged on a gift to prove my gratitude. She tore the ribbon, lifted the lid, and pulled out a neatly stacked pile of papers. Her face shifted, from excitement to confusion, then to horror. I leaned back and spoke just loud enough for everyone to hear. Since the house was going into foreclosure, I stepped in and bought it. So, now I own it. Total silence. Then, the explosion. She jumped up screaming, shaking the papers in her hands. How dare you do this to me? You think you're so smart, don't you? But no one sided with her. Not even my father. He just sighed. I kept my voice calm. You lost it, Mom, not me. That was the night everything changed. The aftermath was immediate and intense. My mother stormed upstairs, slamming the door so hard an ornament fell off the Christmas tree. My brother Daniel glared at me, his fists clenched. Emily just sat there gripping her designer handbag like it was a lifeline. Relatives tried to salvage the evening, refilling drinks, forcing conversations, but the energy had shifted. The room cleared out quickly, some relatives giving me looks of respect, others just awkwardly avoiding eye contact. My aunt, the only one who never played into my mother's games, gave me a small nod before leaving. As I gathered my things to go, Daniel blocked my way in the hallway. His face was red, his voice low and angry. Why did you do this? You humiliated her in front of everyone. He wasn't asking because he didn't understand. He was asking because he didn't want to admit he had benefited from her favoritism his whole life. I didn't argue. I let him rant, then walked around him and left. Later that night, my father found me outside by my car. He wasn't angry, just tired. I knew this was coming, he admitted. I tried to warn her, but she never listened. I waited for him to ask me to back down, to reconsider, but he didn't. He just shook his head. I wish things had gone differently. Then he turned and walked back inside. The calls started the next day. First from relatives, some cautious, some outright admitting they had always seen how my mother treated me. Then came the calls from my mother, but she didn't call me directly. She called my workplace. One morning, my boss pulled me aside, barely able to keep a straight face as he told me about the voicemail. My mother had ranted about my unstable behavior, warned them I was manipulative and dangerous. My boss deleted the message before even finishing it. She didn't stop there. She stayed in the house acting like nothing had happened, as if the foreclosure was a figment of my imagination. Emily started distancing herself, torn between the mess unfolding and the reality she had been trying to ignore. Daniel dug his heels, in fully believing my mother's version of events, that I had blindsided her, betrayed her, and torn the family apart out of spite. It became clear my mother had no intention of moving out or acknowledging what had happened, so I gave her a legal reminder. The first eviction notice was delivered a few weeks later. The paperwork was airtight. She had no legal claim to the house. But she still refused to acknowledge it. That's when she tried one last desperate move. A relative reached out, claiming my mother wanted to make peace over lunch. It was obviously a staged attempt to guilt-trip me. I declined. That night, I got a long, rambling voicemail. First, she was sobbing, begging me to fix this. Then she was furious, blaming me for ruining the family. By the end, she was demanding I undo everything. I deleted the voicemail without responding. I made my boundaries clear. If she wanted to talk, she could do it through an attorney. She never reached out again. The eviction notice arrived, but my mother acted like it didn't exist. She went into full-blown denial, telling everyone it was a misunderstanding, that I was bluffing. She told my siblings I had a vendetta, that I was punishing her for being a strict mother. Daniel believed every word. He called and texted. First with concern, then with anger. When I blocked him, he found another way to lash out. One evening, as I was leaving work, he was waiting in the parking lot. He started shouting, demanding I fix this. Security stepped in immediately. They escorted him off the property, and HR assured me any further incidents would be handled. That was the last time I saw him. My sister, on the other hand, tried to convince me to be the bigger person. I reminded her that our mother had ignored every warning. She went quiet after that, slowly pulling away from the situation. My mother turned to my father, demanding he fix this, but he refused to get involved. She tried something else. A letter. From a lawyer, a family friend who probably Googled eviction laws 10 minutes before drafting it. My lawyer laughed. She had no case. The final eviction notice was served. The sheriff's department made it official. She had 30 days left. No more excuses. No more games. She had lost. With the eviction deadline approaching, my mother didn't look for a new place. Instead, she doubled down on her theatrics. She told everyone she was being forcibly removed by her own daughter. She spun different stories depending on who she was talking to. To some, she was a helpless victim. To others, I was a heartless villain who had stolen the house out from under her. She conveniently left out the part where she had ignored every warning, every overdue bill. Then she tried to go after my job again. My boss pulled me aside, barely containing his amusement. Someone had sent an anonymous email filled with accusations about my unstable behavior and troubling history. It was a mess of lies, clearly an attempt to get me fired. My boss read it out loud, shaking his head before deleting it on the spot. But my brother took things even further. Since I had blocked him, he found another way to lash out. One evening, as I was leaving work, he was waiting in the parking lot. He started shouting, demanding I fix this. Security stepped in immediately. They escorted him off the property, and HR assured me any further incidents would be handled. That was the last time I saw him. My sister reached out, apologizing for our brother's behavior, but still trying to convince me to be the bigger person. I let her talk, but I didn't waver. Then my mother made her most unhinged move yet. The eviction deadline was less than 48 hours away. I got home from work and noticed something was off. The lock on my apartment door wasn't broken, but it felt different. I stepped inside and saw it. My drawers had been rifled through, cabinets left ajar. A few things were missing. I checked my valuables first. My laptop, jewelry, anything expensive, still there. But when I went into my closet, my stomach dropped. A box full of old family heirlooms and childhood photos was gone. So, were my spare house keys. I checked my security cam footage. Sure enough, there she was. My mother. She must have still had an old copy of my apartment key. She had let herself in while I was at work, taken what she wanted, and left. I called the police immediately. They took my statement, checked the Y and security footage, and confirmed she had unlawfully entered my apartment. The officers contacted her directly, warning that if she didn't return the stolen property, I could press formal charges for theft. Instead of denying it, she went on. A tirade insisting the items were rightfully hers. The police told me they could move forward with an arrest if I wished to pursue it. I opted to give her a final chance to return the items before escalating further. The next morning, a package showed up at my apartment. Half of my stolen belongings were inside. The rest were still missing. I followed up with the police, and this time they didn't give her another warning. The report was officially processed, and she now had a criminal case on her record. I didn't wait around to see if she would escalate further. That same night, I changed all my locks, got security cameras installed at every entrance, and alerted my landlord. I wasn't taking any chances. The next morning, eviction day, the police and a court officer arrived at the house to enforce the final removal. A neighbor texted me that my mother was still inside, acting like nothing was happening. When they knocked on the door, she refused to answer. It wasn't until the officers announced they were coming inside that she finally opened it, and then the screaming started. She sobbed, begged, wailed that this was her home, that I was kicking her onto the streets. She called me every name. In the book, accused me of betraying her, of being a soulless, heartless daughter. But none.